questions. So I would just like to introduce the webinar tonight by introducing Family Caregivers of BC. So Family Caregivers of BC, as this slide says, is a nonprofit charity dedicated 100% to the well-being of family caregivers. And this coming year, we will have been in operation for 30 years in July. Oh, it's actually this year. My gosh, here we are, 2019, and we've been serving the whole province for since 2010. And with funding from the Ministry of Health, we are able to run these webinars and have been doing that for the last 5 years. We do a whole bunch of things for caregivers, and I guess what I would strongly encourage you to do, I've put the website address down at the bottom of this slide. The best way of understanding what we do is go to our website, because that will help you sort of with some ideas about what kinds of services we offer. But in a nutshell, we have a toll-free line that you can call during the day, Monday through Friday, 8:30 till 4, and we will just talk to you, listen to what's going on for you, help you with information, navigation, refer you to resources in your communities to the extent that we can. And if your situation is really complex, we have a coach who we refer people to if they're really struggling with a whole bunch of different issues. So that's one really, really great way to connect with us. And then we can send you to all of our other resources. So that kind of ties into support groups that we help to develop across the province. Our website has lots of resources, articles, and you know, our newsletters, our e-news every month. You can subscribe to get those. These webinars are a good example. I was mentioning before that we have recorded webinars on our website, including some fab webinars by Jody in the past on communication and building support networks, which is so important. And we also collaborate with the healthcare sector. So we do a lot of work with healthcare providers across the province in terms of making sure that the family caregiver voice is included in planning and health service delivery. If anybody attending this webinar is interested to learn more about our caregiver engagement program, we are always looking for caregivers who would be willing to attend meetings on behalf of caregivers, to review documents, to be involved in research. So if that's of interest to you, please just go on to our website, and there's a form that you can fill out online to let us know that that might be something. And so now coming to Jody, who you can see on your webcam. Jody is the Executive Director of the Cowichan Family Caregiver Support Society, and she has been collaborating with Family Caregivers of BC for a long time. We've had her do other webinars, as I mentioned. She has done coaching for us, and is just a fantastic partner in having support across the province for caregivers. She also is an instructor at Vancouver Island University and an integrative body psychotherapist in private practice. So Jody has done lots. She's a social worker, has her master's and her registered social worker, and also her designation as an integrative body practitioner, psychotherapist, that's right. And so she's done lots of work in different areas of crisis intervention, family support, mental health. So just brings a lot of experience to these webinars. And I just know that you're really going to enjoy her webinar tonight. So Jody, I'm going to turn it over to you now. I'll change the view here.
Okay.
So now we're going to bring up Jody's presentation.
Great. There it is. Okay, thanks, Janet. That's a great introduction. I always feel a little nervous when I hear myself described that way, because I feel like, especially relative to caregiving, I'm in a position of learning all the time. And one of the ways recently that I learned so much about boundaries and how they apply to caregivers was when I was doing the one-on-one coaching with Family Caregivers of BC for several months last year. And that was very informative for me in understanding how I teach and practice and help people in my practice with boundaries all the time. But caregivers have a very special relationship with boundaries because, by definition, in a position of caring for someone else, you're almost always going to experience more times when you actually can't get your needs met because the needs of the other person are greater than yours. So that's unlike regular life, right? It's one of the big challenges of caregiving. So, boundaries for caregivers is a little more complicated, but I hope that the way that I'm going to approach this and talk to you about it tonight will help you have a sense of knowing how you might be getting into trouble with boundaries. A lot of the time when we talk about boundaries, people think that it's actually a communication skill, right? Like we think that setting a boundary means to say no. But often when we're at the point where we know that we need to say no, and that's the part that we're having trouble with, that's like, maybe 5 steps into the boundary practice process, right? There's something going on way further ahead that lets you know that you're experiencing whatever you're experiencing from the level of boundary. So that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit tonight, that it's not just a communication skill, it's having some awareness, and that awareness actually starts in your body and in other ways that you can perceive that in your experience. So first we'll talk about, and please interrupt if you want to ask questions, please do. I'm really open to that. First, we're going to talk about what are boundaries. This is like a kind of a buzzword. It's one of the vocabulary words we talk a lot about in wellness. And, I just want to make sure we all know what we're talking about. So sometimes we use the word boundary to mean the ability to say no to others, right? So when someone tells you, hey, you really should set a boundary with that person, or you're going to need to set a boundary, what we usually mean is we need to say, hey, no, that's enough. I can't do that. Right? I'm going to suggest to you that boundary setting is more than that. Sometimes that's how it comes forward, but that's not the whole of boundary practice at all. So let's just kind of keep that in mind as we go through. Sometimes we talk about boundary in terms of physical space. Like, how can you tell when someone's in your physical space, in your personal bubble? And often when that's the case, with physical space, we get a strong body message. So often I use the example of, if you were using a bank machine, an automatic teller, and someone was too close to you, a stranger, how would you know that you feel uncomfortable with that? And most of us would get a strong body feeling. There would be some kind of sensation in our body that would tell us that that's not okay, right? And then we would take action. We would probably step away. So in the way that I talk about boundaries, it's very similar in that we get cues from our inner self, from our body, from our emotions that tell us when people are in our emotional space or our mental space, right? That tell us when people are making demands on us, or tell us that things are not comfortable for us. But most of the time, I like to say our volume button for that knowing is turned way down. And sometimes that's because we're very used to not getting our needs met. So part of boundary work or boundary practice is about tuning into more and sooner in the process how we're experiencing our relationships with other people, and when we need to take some action in terms of boundary. Okay. And sometimes we hear the word boundary like in terms of how, like ethical practice, meaning the rules under which you would contact a professional. Like, you probably wouldn't call it your doctor at home even if you could know their number. Do you know what I mean? So it's more around there's professional boundaries. That's another way that we use the word. This is the way that I'm using the word. So a boundary, and I like to call it boundary practice. just like meditation practice or yoga practice or any other practice that you might be engaged in. It's an inner sense of yourself. It's knowing this is me and that is you. So you saw in the first slide, there was a photograph of a woman sitting inside a little bit of a chalk circle. And so it's the idea that on the inside of that experience is the things that come from our inner experience, sensations, feelings, perceptions, and those things are us, right? Outside of that boundary, those are things that are not us. Right? And some of those of us who struggle with boundary practice and boundary in general have a really hard time distinguishing the difference between what is ours and what is someone else's, what is inside our boundary and what is outside of our boundary. So that's one of the things we're going to talk about. It's having a sense of, or how you know where you end and other people begin, right? Or where others end and you begin. So the idea that everything inside my boundary is me and everything outside of my boundary is not me. So, you know, wherever you are right now, if you're sitting in a chair or on the couch, just imagine that you have a boundary around you. And the purpose of the boundary, this is a very important point. The purpose of the boundary is not to keep other people out. That's often when we get into difficulty with boundary, when we've practiced vague boundaries, we think, oh gosh, I need this boundary to keep other people out. And that is actually not what the boundary is for. So this is, for most of us, this is kind of a different way to think about it. The boundary is actually there to be a container for your own energy, right? So if you imagine, and I know talking about energy is a little challenging, but you know, just stay with me here for a minute. If you imagine that the essence of who you are is kind of like an energy, what happens if you don't have a container for it? Right? What happens if you don't have a circle around you that will hold that energy for you? And so if you don't necessarily have that kind of container, or you have it sometimes, you have it intermittently, your energy just kind of leaks out and blends with everybody else's energy. And that's often when we get in trouble. So I often say that we need to be able to practice our boundary, have a sense of our own boundary, so that we know how we're doing, so that we can be good stewards of our own energy, so that we can take good care of our own energy. So without a sense of our own boundary, what is ours and what is not ours, it's really hard for us to know how we're doing, and it's really hard for us to take action to improve how we feel. Does that make sense? So again, if you want to just practice a little bit with me, if you imagine that you have a boundary around you, it can be very big or it can be very small, and just take a few breaths and imagine filling up that space with your own energy. And that's what it is to have a boundary. When we tune into that boundary a little more, we can know right away when someone is trying to come into our boundary, or whether we're stepping right out of our own boundary and taking action in the world that is not necessarily our responsibility. So I'll talk a bit more about that, but hopefully you can have that kind of sense of boundary. And for many, many of us, this is the thing that I see most in my practice, and long before we might become caregivers, is we didn't really get permission to have boundaries, right? We're not practicing, or we just never really knew that we could take space, right? That we could take some space, and that we could take up some space in the world. So often when we have a sense of vague boundaries, and later on in the presentation, I'm going to share with you 3 main styles of boundaries. So having vague boundaries, and having rigid boundaries, and then having sort of a healthier, more flexible boundaries. And that will help you. Hopefully it's more detailed, and it'll show you some of the ways that those boundary patterns show up. And maybe you'll be able to see yourself in some of those common boundary habits, right? And so in caregiving, what I find is most of us get into trouble when our boundaries are too vague. But also we can have some trouble with rigid boundaries sometimes because there are many, many things in caregiving that we're not able to control. So we'll talk more about that in those terms, and we'll get you some more details about it. But for now, just try to picture having, a boundary around you. Can be any size or shape that you like. Everything inside that boundary is your energy, and everything outside of that boundary is not you, including those that you're caring for. And I know that can be a little revolutionary, but we'll talk about that a little more. So again, boundaries are a container for our own energy. And when we have that awareness of our inside experience, it helps us to take better care of ourselves. I know that you've probably heard this a lot about caregiving. We talk about self-care and caregiving, and sometimes that seems like a very impossible task. What I want to say is boundary practice is the foundational aspect of self-care, and it doesn't require that you do anything other than see and hear yourself. Notice how you feel. Even being able to witness yourself in situations where it's going to be very hard to get your needs met is a really important part of boundary practice. It's like reminding you that you exist and that you're here having this extraordinary experience. Okay. So when we are able to practice boundary a little more, it means we have greater awareness of what's inside our boundary and what's outside of our boundary. And the thing about caregiving is there's a lot coming from the outside. And by that I mean there are lots of challenges and lots of the requests and things that we need to do to meet the needs of another person. While we might be consenting to that in the big picture, and we might be saying, yes, of course I want to care for this person, we might experience some of those demands as inundating for us. And so I love this word inundating. It means flooded, So you can let me know if you've ever felt flooded or a little inundated while caregiving. And I think that that's a very common experience when people start to feel overwhelmed. Often when people start to feel resentful or frustrated, it's almost always coming from a feeling of being inundated, like there's simply too much. So having a sense of boundary can help us with that a little bit. We can take care of what happens for us on the inside when something is happening on the outside without necessarily taking action to change what's on the outside. This is really important and also a bit tricky because we know that with caregiving, sometimes there are things that are really difficult for us to endure that are really hard also for us to change. Caregivers sometimes get stuck really trying to change things on the outside of their boundaries and putting a lot of energy into that when it's really, really hard to get results doing that. And so often I do this with my hands when I'm with my clients and with people, where it's sort of like, if you imagine your hands being, our energy is going outwards, it's flowing out into the world, right? And that's fine. We've got to do that sometimes. But when we're doing that all the time without ever tuning our energy into on the inside, right? Having that sense of, so out there, that's what's happening for me. It's often, especially when we're caring for someone who's really close to us, like a spouse or a partner or a parent, where, one part of our process may have been to be able to to process how we feel or to talk about how we feel with that person. And that person might have helped us to figure out what was going on for us on the inside. But this is a skill we really need to be able to do for ourselves, right? To figure out what our inside experience is what it is for us at any given time. Okay, so again, why are boundaries? Sure, of course.
So when you say that you can recognize it on the inside but not do anything about it on the outside, how do you stop yourself?
Okay, this is a good question, and we're gonna address this a little more when we talk about vague and rigid. But there are certain I guess I want to call them boundary skills, right? One of the big boundary skills is the skill of containment. So let's just take an example. We'll take it, it can also apply to caregiving, but let's just say this basic thing when you're in any helping relationship, when you're tempted to do for someone else something that they can do for themselves. Now, maybe it'll take them a lot longer to do that thing, or maybe they won't do it very well. But there's that, have you ever felt this feeling in your body of, like, for me, there's a real energy of, I could just, and it's a kind of a restlessness where I want to help that person, and yet in my mind, I also know that it's best for people to do things for themselves if they are able to, especially if they're experiencing any difficulty, right? Just from an emotional autonomy perspective. So the skill that I will practice in order to, it's like sitting on my hands, that's containment. And so it's like I can feel that my energy is charged up, but I know that I don't have to let that energy go past my boundaries. So that's kind of what I mean when I say, when we can tune into our inner experience and name it, it's a lot easier to not then take action outside of ourselves. One of the things, and we're all going to take action outside of our boundary more times. I'm going to, you will. It's part of being a human. But what I mean about boundary practice is we're taking notice and getting into habits where most of our energy goes out. That is the thing that makes caregiving not sustainable. Those kinds of habits and patterns of relating almost always lead to overwhelm and burnout. It's up to us to be good stewards of our own energy. And I want to say, especially when you're caregiving, because when you're caregiving, no one else is necessarily in a position to do that for you. And what we know, what we hear this all the time from caregivers, is that it's very hard for others, even people who love you, to understand what the particular challenges and burdens of caregiving are. So we often really want other people to understand us, and we miss the part where seeing and hearing ourselves, naming our feelings for ourselves, even having that little inner monologue of, whew, this is rough, helps us to keep our energy in our boundary clearer and more honest. And a lot of the time what happens is we're seeking to sort of offset discomfort by getting impatient and doing things outside of our boundary. Does that answer your question, Janet? We'll talk a bit more about it.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
And I can describe this even in a positive way. Like for me, as okay, so I'll confess I'm a helper. I'm a person who gets good feelings from helping other people. But I also have learned, after however many years in social work practice, that I have limitations to what I can do. So sometimes when I have that feeling of, I could do this, that's actually the feeling of leaving my own energy and going outside of my boundary. That's what that feeling is. And so part of the work is to be able to just contain that feeling and notice how I'm feeling. We'll talk about this a little more as we go through. But can you see already how without a sense of our own boundary, without a container for our own energy, it's really hard to be able to know yourself very well and to take care of yourself. And part of boundary practice is being willing to practice honesty and self-compassion within your boundary, right? Being willing to see yourself clear. Okay, I'm just going to read this. Yes. So a lot of the boundary work that I work on with people does involve breathing and just taking that pause. In the work that I do, we take big, deep breaths through an open mouth. So it'd be like this. and just to try to take a bit more air in than you let back out, and then to just notice what sensations you feel in your body. Often taking 2 or 3 breaths like that, we can actually really tune in to the emotion or the energy that's happening underneath. And I agree with what Jess wrote, that it is easier said than done. And it's often hard to do in the moment. That's why I like to call it boundary practice, because we're always practicing, but having this awareness of boundary, or even having a sense of being able to think back on something that happened or something that went wrong or didn't feel very good, and look at it through the lens of boundary, is really helpful. That's part of that practice. Okay, so when we care for someone else without boundaries or without a consistent boundary practice, this is when we are most susceptible to feeling resentment, frustration, fatigue, and burnout. We know that those things go hand in hand with caregiving. For the vast majority of people, and they are not things that, they're not emotions or feelings or states of mind that cancel out the love and the commitment and the devotion that we feel to the people that we're caring for. But sometimes that we do a bit of a disservice, those of us in caregiver support, when we populate our websites and our brochures with happy, smiling people, and we know that caregiving is not always like that there's a lot of resentment and frustration. And when I was doing the caregiver coaching, and I see caregiver clients for counseling here in the Cowichan Valley, and a lot of the time what I notice is that people who are really stuck in those feelings of resentment and frustration and fatigue are those people who struggle the most with having clear boundaries. And I would say what I see the most is people who have vague boundaries, and those are the givers. Those are people who give away all their energy and don't keep any energy for themselves. The big learning curve there for those folks is to start to practice taking more energy and taking more space, which for them really feels like selfishness. But it's not. It's actually just having a self. And often those patterns and those habits predated caregiving, but when you put caregiving on top of someone who relates to the world like that, it's going to be pretty hard for them. And I would also say that for those of us who have vague boundaries and we are more the giving, we give and give and give and give, it's actually very difficult for us to spend a lot of time in resentment and frustration. We feel guilty for that, right? So we feel bad, and then we feel badly about feeling bad. And that's really not setting ourselves up for sustainable caregiving. Yeah, I hope this is making sense to you guys, and if this is something that is landing for you. These are some big $10 words that I've added here, but that's another thing that's important to look at when we talk about boundary. Without boundaries, we're vulnerable to something called compassion fatigue. Have any of you experienced compassion fatigue? That's a real term. It's a real state. We talk about it in social work all the time. But it's like when we are called upon to be kind and patient and compassionate day in, day out. And I often do this with my hands too. It's like, here's our needs and here's the needs of the people that we're caring for. And this doesn't change. So you can work, you can do as much as you can. You can give as 110% in a given day, and you wake up the next morning and the other person's needs haven't gone down at all. It's literally that you can't really meet this person's needs. So this dynamic, and of course this person is thinking, oh gosh, look at those person's needs. I doesn't matter what I need. Do you see? That's a little bit of that logic error, because actually, if this is your life, if you face every day caring for someone whose needs are far greater than your own, you have to remind yourself to put your needs on the map, because that is actually a very stressful situation to be in. And that is that recipe for compassion fatigue. right? It's hard for us. It's hard for any of us to continually wake up to this situation and have the fullness of our compassion. That, because we're humans, we're humans. That's what makes us compassionate, but that's what also makes us fallible, and we get tired. So compassion fatigue is a good term. What is the cure on any given day for compassion fatigue? A little bit of space. A little bit of space where you don't have to be compassionate, right? Don't go from caregiving to reading about something traumatic that's happening in the world. Just find a place where you don't actually have to be compassionate. And it's okay not to be compassionate 100% of the time. In fact, it's necessary. It's necessary to do that. The other term that I've written here, which is again a bit more of a clinical term, is called vicarious traumatization. And I've included it here because while again it's a term that we use more in the helping professions, caregivers, in my experience, do experience vicarious traumatization, and they do that often when the person that they're caring for has a medical event, or they have to have some intrusive medical procedure, or they have maybe a disrespectful or disempowering interaction sometimes with healthcare, which we know happens. And so it's the vicarious traumatization happens when we witness or hear about pain that other people experience, and we, relative to that, feel powerless, right? So we're in the role a lot of the time as caregivers, as protectors. We're there to protect our person, and sometimes we're not able to do that. So vicarious traumatization is a very another important thing, and again, it comes as the result of not always being able to be clear about our needs, and about it's okay for us to take up space. Okay, I'm just going to read Wendy's comment. Yes, and that's exactly right. We lead with our hearts in these decisions a lot of the time, and and especially those of us who, we know we're pretty competent, we're pretty smart, we're going to figure it out, right? And we do, and this is part of caregiving, but just even recognizing that that's the situation you're in, right? That on any given day, your best efforts not going to make a lot of difference to the big picture. It makes a difference to the small picture, and it makes a difference in the quality of our lives. But, you cannot wake up every morning and remake the world in such a way that it makes it so that your person doesn't have to face the fact that they have this illness. Right? You can wake up every day and make it like before they were diagnosed with dementia. A lot of the time, caregivers, I see that they're actually going way beyond caregiving and actually trying to make it for the other person, as though like to kind of soften the idea of the reality of what the person is living with. And that's too much. There's so much about this that is already hard. We have to be able to look at ourselves and say, I can do this and this and this, but that's actually too much. And this is a really important part about boundaries. Okay, here's another boundary piece, and I kind of, foreshadowed a little bit as well when I said sometimes when we don't have great boundaries, when we have vague boundaries, one of the things that we inadvertently do, or that we is a byproduct of having vague boundaries, is we transgress other people's boundaries. So again, I asked you to imagine having a boundary around you, a circle around you. Sometimes we're the ones who take our foot and stick it in someone else's circle, right? Because we're in our zeal to help and make everything okay. And I think most of us are familiar with that feeling of someone who's too attentive or too helpful. And we experience as a little bit of like, okay, again, the word inundation, right? So we need to understand that when we practice good boundary, and again, sometimes for some of us that feels like selfishness, we're actually showing respect and autonomy for respect for the autonomy of ourselves. We're showing respect for the autonomy of other people. Any boundary work that we can do that helps us also helps our relationships. So it's important to understand that as well. Now, why are boundaries especially important when you are a caregiver? This has been my education over the last few years. Family relationships are very complex. Most caregiving that we are supporting, some people, I love to work with people who are helping, caregiving for their neighbors and their friends. But we see a lot of family caregivers, caregivers who are in some kind of family relationship, and these are complex relationships, and they were complex relationships before we added illness and chronic diagnosis and perhaps cognitive decline and and caregiving, which by definition, again, this is something we don't talk about a lot. Caregiving puts people in a power imbalance, right? When I ask big groups this question, I often say, would you rather be the person who's caring for someone or the person who gets cared for? And people often say they'd rather be the carer. And partially that's because our perception of vulnerability, right, or having to receive is a little uncomfortable for us. So there's a little bit of a power imbalance in caregiving. We often see this as well if there's one sibling, for example, who emerges as the primary caregiver, perhaps for the parents. This often creates complicated power dynamics between the other siblings, and people feel guilty and people feel displaced. And again, it's complicated, and our boundary patterns begin often very early in our lives before caregiving begins. The family patterns that we have don't always get easier when we bring caregiving in, right? So it's like, this is really important to understand. It's like, not only is caregiving hard because you have to do all these things that are overwhelming, caregiving is hard because our family relationships are complicated. And I'm not even talking about families that, are like, oftentimes people are reluctant to identify themselves as having families that struggle. I'm talking about all families. Good, families who function well are also complicated, right? So it's not necessarily about having significant problems. It's just that relating itself is complex. So bringing caregiving into long-standing unconscious patterns of relating, that's a big shaker. That makes things pretty difficult. Again, why are boundaries especially important in caregiving? Caregivers are by definition in a position of offering service, right? So as a caregiver, it's your job to give to someone else. Your role is to give to someone else. That makes it really hard to be like, okay, I'm going to give to myself now. Right? I'm actually going to take a pause, and I'm going to give to myself now. Like, it feels like that's harder often for us to do. But without a sense of our own, again, at the end of the day, if we are out there in the world off being a good steward of someone else's energy, who's looking after our energy? So again, for those of you, if you had a little visual of being here in your boundary, when we are caregiving in an energy deficit position, we essentially get up out of our chair, walk outside of our boundary, and abandon it. Right? And there's no wonder we can't feel well when we've done that. So again, I'm going to say, when you're caregiving, bring yourself with you, bring your boundary with you. This is what's going to make it sustainable. We know that giving to other people, caring for them, loving them in their time of need, in their struggle, it feels good, right? This is what we do. This is what we do. We are here to love one another. But giving more than we wish to, it's important to recognize that. We have a threshold for that, so giving more than we wish to or more than we are able to on any given day. That's when we have diminishing returns for these good feelings. It feels stressful, it creates resentment, it creates guilt for feeling resentment, and it makes it hard to keep giving. So again, I'm suggesting that one of the antidotes, one of the soothing pieces for this is to learn more about our boundary patterns. Caregivers don't always feel like they have permission to say no or set limits. And again, that's back to this thing, right? How does the person whose needs are only this big say to that person, actually, I'm going to say no to your request, right? Or I can only give this much and not that much. It's hard for us to do that. So the needs of the other person always seem greater than the caregivers, and that's just a fact. That's not something that is inaccurate. But the solution to that dilemma is not for you to have fewer needs, because we don't get to decide that as caregivers, right? We cannot take a position where we go, oh, I don't actually need anything, because that's not true. All humans have some needs, and when we go without meeting our needs, we erode our energy. We're not good stewards of our own energy. There's actually always a consequence for that, right? So essentially all you're doing there is you're just borrowing. You're just borrowing against your energy. You know, it's kind of a metaphor, like to say you're creating an energy deficit. And that is the kind of thing that will make caregiving more difficult. So again, as I'm saying, it's really important. It's an essential skill of caring for others to learn how to be a good steward of your own energy. Any questions at this point? Does anybody want to say anything about what I've said so far before I start talking about the patterns that I've kind of talked about a little bit already? If you have a question, just please feel free to type it. And I'm going to go on with some description of this is, I would say, the boundary pattern that we see the most in caregiving relationships. So it's about vague boundaries. So now I'm not talking specifically about caregiving. I'm talking more generally. So in a pattern of vague boundary, and again, we often learn this in our first family. So it's often long standard. Boundary patterns are patterns of relating. They're patterns that we have of relating and communicating with other people in order to feel good and to feel valued and to feel important. So in the pattern of vague boundaries, our connection with another person is very important to us. We feel safe and good when we feel connected to another person. So this connection between me and this other person is so important. I'm going to put all my energetic resources into what does this person need and what does this person want and how can I help this person and what does this person need me to be? And I'm going to forego this connection to myself. So we talk a little bit about how, in vague boundaries, we've kind of turned down the volume for our own needs, right? So in a pattern of vague boundaries, we have a tendency, our go-to move is to put other people's needs and desires first, even when it harms us to do so. So see if you can see any of your own traits in this. And I'm not specifically talking about caregiving now. I'm talking about in any part of your life. In vague boundaries, we have a tendency not to know ourselves very well, our preferences and our needs and our feelings, because we tend to be other focused. We're focused on the other. So an example I often use here is, oh, let's go out for dinner. Sure. Where would you like to go? Oh, and so the other person might ask us, well, I don't know, where do you want to go? And often when we're asked that question, when we have vague boundaries, we don't really know. We go, oh, no, it doesn't matter to me. We'll kind of hand the hot potato off a little bit. And that's partially because we want to stay in connection with the other person, and that's more important to us than where we go for dinner. And it's more important to us than even what we want to eat. The connection is more important. So in this type of boundary style, we have trouble saying no and setting limits. We put other people's needs first and desires first, even when it harms us. And it's this idea of we act on behalf of others, not on our own behalf, right? So it's that idea that we can anticipate, and often this is I talk about this as being a bit of a superpower. People with vague boundaries are extremely good at tuning into what other people need. I mean, they are some of the nicest, most giving people in the world, but they are really using a lot of their energy to tune into what other people need, and it gets out of balance. Right? Nobody can be like this all the time. We have to be able to tune in sometimes. right? We have to be able to, as humans in the world, act on our own behalf, have self-agency, right? The ability to act on our own behalf. And when we have vague boundaries, we tend to act on behalf of others instead of acting on our own behalf. And it's actually difficult for us to act on our own behalf. So can you see how if a person has this style of boundary, the style of relating to other people, that once you put caregiving on top of this is going to be a bit of a recipe for trouble, right? Because caregiving is by definition out of balance. It gets out of balance very soon. The other thing about vague boundaries, and I talked about this a little bit before, is that when we don't have boundaries, we don't have a sense of ourselves, so we don't necessarily see the other people's boundaries either. So we caretake, we give advice, we get involved, and we do all this kinds of helping, and we do for others what they're capable of doing for themselves, or we do more than is needed. Right? And that's because we're trying to get our own need met, and that need is more for connection. So people who have vague boundaries are working pretty hard. They're working pretty hard. They don't tend to be relaxed folks. I wonder if any of you are seeing yourselves in this pattern. But we give our energy away. And part of this is because we're afraid of losing connection to other people if we tell them the truth about our feelings or take space to meet our own needs. Right? So we're going to see in a moment, often one of the defining characteristics of vague boundaries is that we end up kind of getting exhausted. Sometimes we have a little blow up, and then we go over to rigid boundaries. So often, for many of us, the pendulum actually swings between a default position of having vague boundaries, taking care of other people, never putting our own needs on the map, and then very abruptly taking all of our space back, which usually doesn't last very long. So I'll talk about that in a moment. And again, it's just all we're talking about here is tendencies, and it's things that put us out of balance. Like it really sets us up for certain habits and patterns of relating. But these are particularly challenging when you add caregiving, right? And I mean, the reason people adopt this kind of strategy of having vague boundaries is because it works. Being in service to others, being kind to others, anticipating their needs, taking care of their needs. This is a great way to get connection with other people. Although I will say that connection comes almost always because of what we do and not necessarily who we are. Right? So again, it is not necessarily a strategy that is sustainable, but we do it because it works. Because people do connect to us. And often when we have vague boundaries, we like the feeling of being needed. So another trait when we have vague boundaries is it's difficult, if not impossible, for us to be aware of someone else's need and not try to meet it. Right? So we're often quite vigilant. Is everybody okay? How is everybody doing? And I sometimes say it's it's a bit of an exaggeration, but to say, oh, somebody in the room is thirsty, or oh, do you need some water? Here, I'll get it. And it's so automatic that we perceive a need and then we go to meet it. We don't even recognize that. Oh, maybe that's not mine to meet, right? Remember at the beginning when I was talking about the things that are inside our boundary, the things that are outside our boundary, right? In vague boundaries, we don't have a very good sense of that at all. We don't have a good sense. We think everything's in our boundary. We think everything is our responsibility.
So Jody, Teresa
yes.
Asked a question
Yes,
there.
I'm reading this. Yes, okay. Yes, I agree. And I do understand what you're asking there. So yes, when you start out with a vague boundary and then you're caregiving for somebody who has trouble speaking, and then you're literally in a position of having to speak for them, right? And this, caregiving puts us into all sorts of situations that are fraught with power dynamics and, almost sometimes even ethical situations. A classic thing that I think about is when a caregiver takes their person to a doctor, for example. And the care receiver often gets upset when the physician will speak to the caregiver instead of speaking to them, right? So they're speaking to the caregiver as a proxy. And sometimes the care receiver doesn't feel seen in that interaction. But the reality is also that the caregiver isn't seen either, right, by the physician, because, and I'm not trying to knock physicians, I'm trying to show an example of how tricky it gets for caregivers, because yes, the caregiver is having the interaction with the physician, but not as themselves, right? The physician is seeing the caregiver as a proxy for the person. So they might be saying, well, make sure, this is the medication and come back in a few months and you're going to get the referral and things like this. But they don't see the caregiver in their role as caregiver. Right? And for many caregivers, it actually feels uncomfortable or counterintuitive to show up as a caregiver or to ask the physician a question, like even about themselves. And many times caregivers have their own health issues that are getting worse because of the stress of caregiving. So really, in that interaction, neither person gets seen. And with vague boundaries, you might not notice that so much, right? Because it's like there's something that happens in vague boundaries where being helpful actually feels like success, right? So again, you can see in this example that if there's a need in the room and we haven't met it yet, there's that feeling of anxiety, right? That it's your job to meet other people's needs. And so again, in caregiving, when it's your job to meet someone else's needs, it's especially hard for us to say, and I also have to meet my own needs. Because whose job is it to meet your own needs? That can only be yours. With the vague boundaries, this is the sort of like the unconscious thinking is that I'm going to meet the needs of everybody else, and then it's going to come back around to me, right? Like all my goodwill and all my good deeds, it's going to come back around, and people are going to look after me. And of course, that's not very often that actually is successful. Most of the time, that's not how it works. But I'm going to tell you, in caregiving, it will definitely not work that way, right? Because the other person is not able to do that. So again, these are often unconscious patterns, but once we get into caregiving, we're really risking resentment, frustration, burnout. And that is not what we want for the person that we're looking after either. So there's this quote here, when you say yes to others, make sure you're not saying no to yourself. And that is often exactly how it's happening, right? That we say, yes, I will give you my energy. And by doing so, we're saying, I don't need my own energy, right? And I'm trying to say, imagine, I'm not sure if it's true, but imagine we have a finite amount of energy for any given day. You have to keep some for yourself. That is not selfish. That is having a self. That is allowing yourself to have a self. And if you're in a caregiving role, you're going to need yourself. You're going to need yourself. The other person needs you to have a self. It's not good for them either if you give all your energy away. So let's take a look then at what happens. There are people who have rigid boundaries as a boundary style of relating. That's a standalone style. But often what happens is we spend a lot of time in our pattern of vague boundaries, and we're giving our energy away, and we kind of hit the wall. And often, if you have ever found yourself saying to someone, I've done this and this and this and this, and you can't even do this little thing for me, that is a sign, that's like a little reverse diagnostic that you've been in vague boundaries and you are now experiencing what I call the tsunami of resentment. Now, you might not be feeling this towards your the person that you're caring for, but you might displace this kind of frustration onto somebody else. And that's often what we see, especially in sibling groups or with parents and adult children, is, this venting has to go somewhere. So this resentment, and I mean, often it's very in the moment it feels like a relief to vent off some of this resentment, but for those of us who's we're trying very hard to be kind and to get our needs met through giving, it's really tough for us to experience one of these where we kind of lose it and we show how angry we actually are on the inside. And sometimes that's actually very surprising for us as well. We don't want to face how resentful we feel. So in rigid boundaries, rigid boundaries is how I said at the beginning, vague boundaries is about, I need to connect with you. So my connection with myself, that's not important. It's all about connecting with you. In rigid boundaries, it's like, I'm connected to myself. Oh, yes, here I am. I feel I'm connected to myself. I can meet my own needs, but I can't connect with you, because if I connect with you, I'm going to lose this connection to myself, and I won't lose it. Do you see? So it's still a strategy where it feels like we can't be connected to the other person and stay connected to ourselves at the same time. That's really what healthy boundaries are, right? I can tune into your energy. I can see what you need. I can see what I need. I can feel connection with you, and I can feel connection to myself. I can hear what you have to say, and I can hear my own inner voice. But in this style, it's like I can hear my inner voice, but I can't connect with you, because if I do, I'm going to lose this connection to myself. And often when we go from vague boundaries to rigid boundaries, we just found this connection to ourselves. We don't want to lose it. So we feel a strong need to protect ourselves. We can be defensive when we're in this particular style. Some of you might be able to recognize this in some of the people that you know. Folks with rigid boundaries, or a pattern of rigid boundaries, they feel separate from others, and that feels safe. That feels safer to us. So this boundary is a bit more like a wall, right? Where in vague boundaries, we don't have a boundary at all. This is kind of like, a protective wall. And the idea of being able to retreat from inundation feels good. So in this style of boundary, we maintain a sense of connection to ourselves by keeping other people at a distance. And again, like as I've already said, it's like we fear that we'll lose our sense of connection to ourselves if we connect with other people. And yet this is a pretty tough place to be in, because we all need connection with other people, right? Sometimes what I see in caregivers is that they have maybe vague boundaries with the person that they're caring for. So giving their energy away. And what compensates for that is they have rigid boundaries in other relationships, right? To try to make up for that energy deficit. So sometimes with other people in our lives, we're grumpy, we're defensive, we're a little distant, and caregiving can do that. In terms of the way that it changes the way we relate to people. Another trait of when we're in that state of having rigid boundaries, we say no very frequently, when sometimes we're grumpy about it, and we might say no a bit more forcefully than we mean to. And that's simply because we want to hang on to that connection with ourselves, and we feel a bit overwhelmed. Yeah. And so, as I've been saying, often we swing over to rigid boundaries after having had vague boundaries, and then we get hurt or exhausted. And we just, it's sort of like, no, I don't need any space. I don't need any space. I don't need any space. Oh my gosh, I need some space, And so, again, this is what I'm trying to encourage you as caregivers to do, is to take the space in a preventative way. Before the burnout happens, before the resentment happens, before the swing over to the rigid boundaries, to be able to understand that as a caregiver, you're absolutely going to need to feel into your boundary, to take space for yourself, to be honest with how you feel, to not judge yourself about how you feel, because we know that very few people are able to caregive without some of these very difficult feelings. And so when, of course, in rigid boundaries, like once we claim back the space, But for those of us who mostly do have a pattern of a more of a default pattern of vague boundaries, we're not going to last too long here in our wall. You know, like it feels hard to get our connection with ourselves, and finally I've gotten a little space, and then we start to feel guilty for the way we spoke to people. We start to feel guilty for maybe getting angry or showing our resentment, and it won't be too long before we come back out with our vague boundaries. What can I do for you? How can I meet your needs, right? So when this pendulum is kind of swinging back and forth, this is a very exhausting lifestyle. You know, it's hard on us emotionally. It's maybe hard on other people because we're so nice and kind until we're not, and then we are again. And so it can be very difficult for us to even understand why we're acting this way. So I hope that some of that feels familiar to you, and that you see some of your boundary patterns in there. Again, you know, at the beginning when I gave that example of sort of being at the bank machine and being able to tell when someone's in your physical space, and I suggested that we have the ability to have that same early alert system or sensations or some information from ourselves that will tell us when someone's in our emotional space, meaning when we're giving away too much, or we're never saying no to someone else's requests or demands, or our response to the needs being higher all the time is to just constantly try to meet them by denying our own needs. Right? And so what is the physical sensation of that? That's what boundary practice is, to be able to tune into that sense of your boundary. So maybe before we talk about healthy, flexible boundaries, let's do a little exercise if you want, if you're willing to do that with me. Of course, it's entirely optional, but just for a moment, take a moment, maybe if you want to, you can close your eyes and just visualize having a boundary around yourself. So see how that would feel. You know, you can just imagine a space. It can be as big or as small. It doesn't have to be a circle. And just take a couple of breaths into your body and imagine filling this space with your own energy. You know, so your energy might have a quality. It might be swirling, or it might have a color, or maybe it's warmer, but there's got to be something that distinguishes the energy inside your boundary from the energy outside your boundary. So something in there that is the quality of you. Let's take a few breaths there and try to fill up that space between you and the edge of your boundary with your own energy. And if you think you have a sense of that, I invite you to just make your boundary really small. So just pull it in and make it as small as you can. Just keep breathing and see how that feels in your body. What do you notice? What sensations do you notice now that you've made your boundary really small? And when you think you have a sense of that in your body, just make your boundary really, really big. Stretch it out and make it as big as the room you're in. Make it as big as you can. The whole, you can just make it as big as you want to. And stretch your energy out there and see how that feels in your body to have this very, very big boundary. And does that feel good to you? Is it something that you feel like you can maintain? And take a breath there. And when you think you have a sense of that, bring your boundary back into the perfect boundary for you, the perfect size and shape. So maybe that's the same as where you started, or maybe it's not. But it's just having, again, a sense of this is how much space it takes for your energy to feel comfortable and for you to tune into your energy. So the title of this workshop was Knowing When to Draw the Line. Knowing where, like what Janet just wrote, find your Goldilocks boundary. So, is yours the big bowl of porridge or the small one? So again, it's like for many people, and if we were really doing this in a workshop, I would love to know what you experienced in your body when we did that exercise. But for many people, this boundary stuff is a little kooky, it's a little vague, but often we can feel what it feels like in our bodies when our boundary gets really small. And for many of us, that feeling is familiar in our life. That if we were actually to pay a little closer attention to what it feels like in our boundary energy, yes, Pat says suffocating. Yeah, I immediately felt that even after all this time of doing boundary work, felt constricting and then not sustainable. That's right. Some of us get a little feeling of panic, right? But again, I'm going to suggest that feeling is a familiar one. There are times and spaces in your day when that's what your boundary feels like. And so a lot of the time it's just that practice of where's my boundary? Where's my boundary now? Just doing a little reminder. And then every time we notice, oh, it's very small, just take a breath and bring it back out to where it needs to be. You might be caregiving and you might be in a very complex situation, but you're a human being and you're allowed to take up space. It's not necessary or good for your caregiving for you to feel constricted in that way. Right? That's a sign that you're actually not taking up enough space for yourself. So this is both a metaphor, like in the sense that I'm talking about taking up space energetically, but I'm also talking about how it feels to be a caregiver and to feel like you can't meet any of your own needs. That simple act of taking a breath into your body reminds you that it's okay for you to be here and to be feeling whatever it is that you're feeling. So again, we titled the workshop knowing when to draw the line, and the answer to that question is it's in your felt sense. That's when you know when you have to draw the line. It's different for every caregiver. There's no rule where you can say, oh, if this happens, then you really have to take this action. Or if your care receiver asks you to do this, you really have to have this response. Because, of course, that's ridiculous. It's different for all of us. But anything that's in our caregiving day or life that makes us feel like that constricted boundary is worth noticing. It's worth noticing and paying some attention to that. Also, many people, when we do the part where we make our boundary very big, people feel like that feels good for a moment, but also feels like, oh, I can't maintain that, right? We don't need all the space. We just need the space that feels right for us. So like Janet said, our Goldilocks boundary, the one that feels just right. And as you practice that a little bit, in my office with my clients, I often do this with yarn. I have a basket of yarn behind me, and I invite people to take a ball of yarn and to put a boundary literally around themselves. Sometimes they think this is kind of an odd thing to do, but almost everybody can feel it when I ask them to make the boundary a little smaller. And once you do that, you can come back out to knowing, okay, no, this is the better boundary for me, right? So I hope that makes a little sense to you. In healthy, flexible boundaries, it means that we can connect to someone else, so I can have my connection with you and I can stay connected to myself at the same time. So do you see the difference? It's like I don't have to work hard to have my connection with you at the expense of myself, and I also don't have to only maintain my connection to myself at the expense of connecting with you. I get to have both things, and I can shuttle back and forth between this awareness. We can be present to another person and present to ourselves at the same time. And that feels much better. Yes, I'm hearing this question about how to make or explain boundaries to a person with dementia or Alzheimer's. And that's very difficult. I'm not going to minimize the difficulty of doing that with someone who has some cognitive impairment. But a lot of the time, again, and I know the idea of energy is a little challenging for some of us, but to think of it in terms of our energy, when our energy is clear and good, often that makes our communication and our experience with someone with cognitive impairment a different experience, right? Than when we come in our energy that's kind of frustrated and annoyed and resentful, and we're trying to be kind, but we don't really feel kind on the inside. And often I think people respond to our energy in that way as well. So I'm not sure whether we can explain it in words necessarily. It's almost like if we practice it, we can experiment with noticing whether that has an effect on the other person, and whether it has an effect on how we feel when we're around them, whether that has an effect on how they feel when they're around us, right? I often say this in my counseling practice when people say, oh, how do I fix my daughter's boundaries or my husband's boundaries? And I say, well, just focus on your own boundaries. The best way to affect anybody else's energy is to stay in your own energy. Again, a boundary is not there to keep other people out. It's there as a container for yourself, right? So that makes you feel towards other people. Other people experience you as much more grounded, much more centered in yourself. And that's more relaxing to be around. Oh, that's okay. Cool. Thanks, Jess, for that recommendation. Like Janet said, there is a handout that comes with this webinar that you can print out, or and I could maybe also send Janet some other resources that might be good. There's I find a lot of the resources on the internet and in the world around boundary focus on boundary more as a communication skill, like more as how to set boundaries with people. And I'm trying to suggest that even knowing when you need to set a boundary is actually a much more important place to start. And then what you say is not as important as how it actually feels, how your energy feels. Yeah, thank you for that comment, Mary. Yeah, so this is the thing. And when you think about how lovely this would feel to have a connection with others without losing a connection to ourselves, for many of us, this is really not how we experience connection. We feel like, the phrase I often use for this is, we feel like we need to earn our love. Right? If we're not out there earning our love, then none is going to flow to us. And really, a lot of the times, if we're working hard in order to be loved or connected, we're actually in a state of having a vague boundary. And in a healthy boundary, we don't have to self-abandon. We don't have to lose that connection with ourselves. It's okay for us to sometimes take space. We don't have to be in service to other people all the time. So again, the idea in a healthy, flexible boundary is, I can see and hear myself, and I know what I need and want and feel most of the time. Now, this does not mean I'm going to get it. This does not mean I'm going to get what I want or need most of the time, but it's really important for me to know what that is. So the example I often give of this is a bit silly, but I have these two young daughters, and they're very spirited and very loud, and early days in my parenting, I'd often be in the car with them, and they'd be singing the alphabet in operatic style, or just, but very joyful and happy, but so loud. And I would just be able to see and hear myself in that moment of being completely inundated, and know that I had a choice of whether to ask them to be quiet, but also knowing that in my goal as a mother is to enjoy their vitality, and especially when they're being loud in a joyful way, I don't necessarily want to stifle that. So it's like, I might not get what I want or need as I'm driving in the car with these budding opera singers, but I can see that I need it. I can name it for myself. I can see and hear myself. And that means that maybe later on in the day, I'll find some time for myself. Right? I'll put myself on the map. It doesn't mean I get it in the moment, but knowing what I need actually makes a difference to how my life feels. It makes me feel less oppressed or put upon. Do you understand what I'm saying? So this is very relevant to caregiving, because there are literally, times in caregiving where you're just not going to get your needs met, and you know it. Right? You know that. But being able to name that need for yourself, or even to say, oh, sweetie, you are exhausted and there's not going to be any rest for you anytime soon. I mean, that can be a state of mind that produces resentment, but it can also be a moment of softness and self-compassion for you, right? And also, we really need to be able to just tell the truth about all the range of emotions that come with this caregiving journey. Yes. So we can say no and we can say yes in healthy boundaries to ourselves and to others, right? So what I mean by this is I can say to myself, no, Jody, maybe you want to stay up late and watch yet another episode of something on Netflix, but you're going to go to bed, right? Because that's what you need. Or maybe I say, I hear myself saying, oh, yes, I can do that extra piece of work. And then I go, actually, no, I'm going to need to take that space for myself. So it's like learning that I can say yes and no to myself and to other people. No, Pat, you should not feel guilty about respite. You should not. And honestly, I love to coach people on this kind of stuff around even having a sense of humor. Like I would say, get yourself a Post-it notepad and write, don't feel guilty about respite on that Post-it note and put it up around your house. You know, you have to sometimes train yourself, especially when you're one of those givers with vague boundaries who has spent a lot of time in their life denying their own needs. I mean, we have to teach ourselves how not to feel guilty. We have to teach ourselves that it's okay for us to feel the way we feel. It's okay for us to have needs and to need space and time. And that's why respite was invented. That's what it's for. And I understand our care receivers, a lot of the time, they don't want to go to respite. For them, it feels like a disruption to their routine. It feels like a punishment. We know that that's not what it is. We know that the whole situation, the whole caregiving situation, depends on how our energy is doing, right? So if we're not looking after our energy, the whole thing is pretty precarious. So yeah, we don't feel guilty about respite. We say, thank goodness there is respite. I'm going to make the most of this respite. I'm not going to spend one moment of this respite feeling guilty, because respite is very precious time. And, you know, it's also okay to do nothing with your respite and just lay on the couch if you like to, you know. Yeah, thank you for that. That's a very important piece. I think that's often, we often say about caregiving that guilt and resentment are the rock and the hard place of caregiving. Like very few people get out of caregiving without feeling those two things a fair amount of the time. So that's, again, one of the other webinars I did, hey, Janet, was self-compassion, and that one was quite popular because it's really that piece around just really being so kind to yourself, you know. And I'm going to suggest these two concepts go hand in hand. Our self-compassion has nowhere to live if we don't have a container for our own energy, right? Our self-compassion lives in our boundary. And my wish for every caregiver in the world would be to just have a beautiful boundary, nice and flexible, full up of self-compassion, right? Where they can just feel what they feel on any given day, even if it's dark and ugly, and just have a lot of love for themselves, because what you're doing is so important. Yes. So again, in healthy, flexible boundaries, we can see and respect other people's boundaries without feeling abandoned, without thinking that they're withholding from us. Again, we can separate our feelings from other people's feelings while still feeling empathy. So again, what I said at the beginning, you know, when we're talking about the inside and the outside, it's like, it's sometimes I get people to draw this, you know, you can draw it on a piece of paper. Here's my boundary. What's inside there? Inside there are, you know, what you can name some of your feelings, and the things that are outside your boundary are other people's feelings and other people's opinions and other people's thoughts about anything, right? Those are things that might affect your energy in your boundary for sure, but they're actually not in there. And sometimes what I invite people to do is literally, you know, if they notice that something is in their boundary, like, you know, what your sister thinks of what you're doing, it's like you can just pluck that and just put it out like you know, just put it on the outside, because that's something that doesn't belong in your boundary. So it's a bit of practice, and we can do this with a bit of a sense of humor to really name, this is mine and that is not mine. right? And some of this we have to teach ourselves. We didn't come in knowing this, right? So the great benefit, I'm trying to sell you on healthy boundaries, and the great benefit of it is that when you practice having, giving yourself the space to feel your own feelings and to have that energetic container, we feel more grounded. We feel more confident and capable of handling most situations, right? We know that if we're having an emotional response like fatigue, it's our responsibility to take care of ourselves, not someone else's. Oh, thank you, Neve. Yeah, that's how I think, is a little bit in visuals. And as you can see, the frame can't even contain my hand gestures. But anyway, again, a lot of the time it is that idea of, yeah, we might be really upset or really having some emotional needs in our boundary, but knowing that we can name that. And sometimes part of having, like, often what a phrase that I say is that here in my boundary, I have all the resources I need to take care of myself. Right? And one of those resources might be talking to somebody about how I feel. But one of the best boundary statements is, here in my boundary, I have what I need to take care of myself. There's nothing that anybody else needs to do for me. Right? Sometimes I might ask people for help or for assistance, but really, I know that I can take care of my own self. That's part of what it means to allow yourself to take up space. So I anticipated that slide. And then ultimately, this is the whole thing around boundaries, right? The whole purpose of boundary is to have better, more authentic and sustainable connections. Boundaries are about love. They're about being available for a higher quality of connection that is going to be more sustainable over time. And often when I talk about this, it's sort of like, you cannot get to wellness, you cannot get to well-being through exhaustion, right? The path to feeling better cannot require you to feel terrible along the way. That's just not the way it works, right? So sometimes stopping, taking a breath, referencing your body, even if you want to use that visual metaphor of, like, just where is my boundary? Do I have a boundary? How would it feel to have it? But what's the quality of the energy in my boundary right now? That can be just a good reminder. So often I ask people, just throughout the day, a few times a day, ask yourself, where's my boundary? Am I breathing? And to really pay attention to what it feels like to feel grounded and what it. Yeah. Thanks, you guys.
Wow.
Thanks for those nice comments. Yeah.
So awesome, Jody. You rocked it. I did all the exercises here in my little office, and I really felt it. So I hope all of you did too.
Did you feel that, Janet? Did you feel that in your body doing that last one?
Yeah. Amazing. So thank you so much, and I'm going to just end with this last slide, which is a reminder about us here. We're here to listen. We're here to talk to you. We have all kinds of resources. Please be in touch with us, and we have lots of webinars always. Jody's are fantastic. Jody, thank you so much.
Oh, and you're so welcome.
Group. Thank you for all of your comments and for participating. It makes such a difference. So